Honorable discharge. I want my life back. My parents had been married for almost 50 years when my father died a quarter of a century ago. It had been, in my mother's words, a torrid romance. And it is the case that she never looked at another man, though other men were interested. She seemed content to spend the rest of her life in one of the houses in Imperial Beach that they had worked so hard to own. Of my mother's 4 sons, I had fantasized that I was the only one to escape the undertow of her prolonged widowhood. I never once imagined that my mother, after 20 years of mourning just 5 miles north of the US-Mexico border, would end up spending the last 3 years of her life less than a few miles from where I live and work in Long Beach. When she arrived at LAX in August 2016, I began the self-imposed existential task of nurturing a person with whom I shared very little in common. It turned out that she lived another 3 years. Though in the middle of it, it seemed like an indeterminate sentence, during which I did my best to honor my father's memory by making sure that she received the best possible care. With the exception of some crucial help that my brother Jim gave me early on, it was largely a solitary effort. My mother would have preferred to be cared for by her youngest daughter, but that was impossible since she lived thousands of miles away in another country. During those 3 years, as she moved to and from various facilities and hospitals, I can't say that we got to know each other any better. You don't have time for chit-chat, she once commented to me. And I could have responded, nor much tolerance for it either. At least we each got brief glimpses of the other's need to control our lives more than we had any right to expect. About a week before my mother died, at age 97, for instance, she stretched out on her bed in the small room she occupied with 2 other people at a skilled nursing facility and said, "I want my life back." Which one I wanted to ask her, but of course didn't. The life before you had children, or the one after? I remembered all too well how by the time her final child was born in Norfolk, Virginia, the charm of maternity was no substitute for the life she imagined in 1945. She had served in the US Navy during World War II, as had my father, cleaning out her house in order to sell it to pay for her care. I found her honorable discharge papers and a small rectangular bracket for future plans. The words, "Attend University of California, Berkeley," were neatly inserted. "I want my life back," she repeated. I felt sorry for her at that moment. While one doesn't live to be 97 unless one clings to life, unless it seems like the most precious flotation device in the enormous ocean of eternity, which in fact it is. Nevertheless, not to look down and at an inlet of shallow water and see the coral reefs under one's feet, and to know that one is indeed a triumphant channel swimmer, felt as if she were unable to honor herself. What did it mean that I had been of service to her for the past 3 years if she herself did not recognize this opportunity to be once again with the man she had spoken of just a few weeks before, with utter longing in her voice? I miss him so much. I don't miss my mother, a lack of feeling that has been evident ever since the day I first went to school. She walked me to the front gate, she told me years later, where other children clung to their mothers weeping, I stepped through the gate, gave a little skip, and turned and said, "Goodbye," then eagerly walked toward a building with a row of classrooms. On the other hand, far more than I want to acknowledge, I am the truculent culmination of being my mother's first child. You wore me out, telling me I had to come outside and see what you had found. The world is still like that for me. See what I have found is the pulse behind my poems, though I don't mean just the ones I have written, but the ones I read by other poets. If I got deterred into working for so many years as an editor and publisher of poets in Los Angeles, it was because I was so excited about the diversity of poets I found here. "I want my life back," she said a third time. "So do I, Mom. So do I." We sat quietly together for several minutes. She dozed off. The dietitian came by to discuss her lack of appetite. I kissed her forehead and walked down the hall and outside the building. By chance, one of Long Beach's community theaters is adjacent to the skilled nursing facility my mother spent her last year in. On the second-story roof, there is a pair of the classic mask, comedy and tragedy. And in a private ritual, I would give them a tiny nod and a sly wink every time I visited. But there is also the mask of one's appearance, one's own face, the one my mother could only dimly see when I announced my arrival to a half-asleep, crumpled figure barely covered by a bed sheet. "Bill's here," and she would stir and ask, "My Bill? My Bill?" Shortly after I was born, my mother wrote her mother and commented with a touch of dismay that, quote, "He has my nose," unquote. By that, she meant a Dutch nose with a curved slope and a hefty nub. My father was tall with a strong arched nose, and no doubt she chose him out of a hope that her offspring would not look like her. But I do look like her, and I am stubborn like her. Without that stubbornness, in fact, she would not have received the quality of care she did in her last 3 years. Perhaps I have to concede, in contrast to my protestations, there is more affinity between my mother and me than I want to admit. It's certainly visible in one of the poems that feature her, entitled "Wrinkles," which an online outlet, Poetry Daily, requested permission to reprint 2 months before she died. I thought continuously about that poem as I worked on this presentation for backstory. I wondered if this prose is the backstory, or is the poem I am about to read the backstory, the one hidden out of reluctance to acknowledge what is painfully obvious to others. Part 2, Wrinkles. As though it could do anything but vanish, my mother's life is only tiny stories now, and what I remember of them afterward, how she loved to iron and drink beer on hot nights. I too love to flatten wrinkles out of a shirt with light blue or dark green or white cuffs. Tonight I'm sipping beer, the radio's playing Bird of Prey blues, followed by All for You. It doesn't take much to get me drunk. Even so, I don't have enough beer to savor it. I finish another 3 shirts and imagine the wrinkles lifting off, layering and coiling themselves around me like petals of an invisible bouquet. I think of my mother sitting in a front row of folded chairs at Fort Rosecrans as I stood to speak about the man whose uniform she ironed, the man whose ashes were slowly marched in front of us. This last shirt won't work with the iron. It curdles in a corner, bunches, and won't smooth. A couple of hours later, it's still too hot to sleep. My bare feet up on a wooden windowsill, big frame plate glass up. The rumor that proportion is only focus turned inside out is true enough to know its sneakiness. The peppermint tea on the table is slowly cooling, so I know it's not time that's altering this clarity. My mother says, I don't think we ever really know anybody else. I don't even know if we finish knowing ourselves. She's sitting in her kitchen, refusing to eat any supper, insisting she's full from lunch, happy that I'm visiting long enough so that we can talk. At 75, she hammers together boards for a raised bed in her garden, irises, gladiolas, lilies. This afternoon, we were both reaching for a piece of paper, and I brushed her fingertips. My hands are almost as small as hers. The warmth that in an instant gushed from her hand was pure out of focus accident. The slow heat of a third-year widow scorching a room he sat in before he got up, folded towels, went to sleep, and died.